Hello, and welcome to Emerging Viewpoints. I'm Nick Stockmiller. Today we're joined by Nick Trickett to discuss the impact of Western sanctions on Russia and how its economy can adapt to this new landscape. Nick is an analyst who covers Russia, its political economy, and foreign policy. He is the former editor-in-chief of Bear Market Brief Russia, a newsletter published by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and later his own newsletter and blog, OGs and OFZs. Nick holds an MA in Russian and Eurasian Area Studies from the European University in St. Petersburg and an MSc in International Political Economy from the London School of Economics. Nick currently works with Fitch Solutions as a commodities analyst specializing in mining and metals, and previously worked as an oil and gas consultant with Wood Mackenzie. The opinions expressed today are Nick's own and not those of his employer. Nick, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start by talking about the short-term impact of Western sanctions on Russia. Now, a lot of analysts looked at the ruble as a proxy for how the Russian economy was dealing with sanctions. And shortly after those sanctions were announced after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the ruble briefly went north of 150 to the dollar, which led to some officials in Washington talking about reducing the ruble to ruble. I think they probably regret those statements now, since the ruble subsequently strengthened quite a bit, getting down to about 53 to the dollar now as a result of capital controls and other measures implemented by Russian authorities. So the ruble is probably not a very good proxy for what's happening in the Russian economy. And this is obviously a longer game. Bank of Russia Governor Elvira Nabiullina talked about a structural transformation in the Russian economy that will play out over time. So could you please go through what impact we've seen on the Russian economy so far as a result of Western sanctions, and how you expect that effect to evolve over time?
That's a good question. So I think, kind of building on your point about the ruble, the best place to start is simply the fact that these sanctions are not economic blitzkrieg, despite the fact that it's fashionable to suggest that they were an attempt to kind of prevent the regime from continuing its military operation in Ukraine. I don't think that anybody reasonably could have expected to stop it once it started. That said, I would say in terms of the immediate impacts, we have seen some major drop-offs in production activities. So things like autos, for example, have taken a huge tumble because of the loss of imported parts, semiconductors, similar things that have export controls placed on them by the U.S. and U.S. partners, and like in this case, primarily in Asia, but also in Europe. And so the loss of the export of European industrial goods and some Asian industrial goods is kind of leading to shortages. You've seen entire factories actually throttle capacity, or essentially tell people to take a furlough for 2 months' time and then say we'll come back and make more later. That's starting to kind of spill over. So we saw some of our first strike action in the Urals actually recently as a result of those furloughs. I'm trying to remember which plant it is right now. I think it was rail wagons, but I'd have to double check that. But in the short term, that there's a massive drop off in the access to Western brands that initially kind of looked to pull out of the market. You have people trying to substitute McDonald's with a Russian equivalent and kind of continue operations, as a kind of famous example. But we have seen like a huge hit to consumption activity, and the fact that we've actually seen a slowdown in inflation in the last 4 to 5, 6 weeks in the Russian economy suggests that there's a huge collapse in consumption. That's kind of taking place. And a lot of the strength of the ruble actually has less to do with capital controls, though obviously that's a huge component, and those export controls that I've mentioned. If Russia can't import a huge portion of the industrial production needs that it generally relies on from abroad, that artificially inflates the current account surplus. So even if export volumes of oil and gas are falling, the price levels are high enough to offset that in monetary terms. But the result is that you get a kind of overly strengthened ruble, which people like Gref from Sberbank and like other figures kind of recognize that a strong ruble is the worst possible thing for the Russian economy if it wants to undergo this kind of structural transformation. So I think we're already seeing a huge drag for households. We're seeing slowdowns in construction activity. And there's been a bit of a rebound in kind of firm sentiment in the previous month, and kind of PMIs, but that's also started to tip over again. But what we're going to kind of start seeing that become increasingly are really, really profound shortages. I mean, we're already seeing Russian airlines essentially try to scrap, planes that were previously used for international routes that are no longer running because of flight bans, for parts, or old disused planes for parts, because they can't actually get replacements anymore. The first couple of months, we're seeing the initial shock hit households, but we're going to start seeing it affect employment more and more, and kind of industrial economic consumption more and more. I think in the next 3-4 months.
So you talked about declining employment and effects on employment, and also the need to get more products that they were previously importing. And so that suggests that there could be some pressure on the government to step in to support the economy through direct measures, and also to increase investment in order to build that productive capacity. But Finance Minister Anton Silyanov has pushed back against those calls for increased government involvement and increased government spending. Do you think that the Russian government can continue this tight-fisted conservative fiscal stance in the face of all the challenges that they're facing right now?
So the unfortunate answer is yes and no. As always, I mean, the reason why Silyanov specifically is so tight-fisted, aside from it being his kind of political job to be tight-fisted, really goes back to the late 90s. The fact is that the collapse of Russia's economic institutions after the collapse of the Soviet Union meant that by 98, when you have the default crisis hit, the only real means of stabilization that they could use were macroeconomic instruments. So, the central bank, monetary policy, and fiscal policy, right? And ever since then, there's been this default bias to try to essentially manage the economy through those mechanisms, and consciously carve out and kind of weaken the power the state has to coordinate economic activity in a more proactive fashion. The reason why I think Silyanov is right to some extent is that with a drastic loss of imports and the lack of domestic alternatives for lots of these goods, any fiscal expansion that's used to try to prop up investment into production is going to be inflationary to a significant degree. And on top of that, you have the fact that the labor market's really in trouble. I mean, they still haven't recovered their pre-COVID, like flows of migrant labor from Central Asia, for instance. And I mean, you'll have an influx of displaced people from Ukraine, refugees, et cetera, but that's not going to be enough to meaningfully fix the problem, especially because the issue isn't simply the number of bodies; it's also where the bodies are located, right? I mean, I remember hearing anecdotes during the kind of height of the building boom, the kind of mortgage application boom in like last year. People were trying to exploit subsidized mortgages to buy their own homes or apartments. And construction companies were basically bribing other people's workers to come join them because they couldn't find enough labor. So there were constant fights back and forth on construction sites with people going around offering more money to the Central Asian migrant laborers they're relying on. And that dynamic hasn't changed. I mean, there's a reason why last year they also started looking at using prison labor to build railways. So in that sense, I think that if the regime is worried about inflation, which it always is, because obviously it's worried about pensioners and the people that tend to form its core support groups, any attempt to significantly stimulate investment into production is going to be inflationary because they simply don't have the inputs to physically make all of it, and they're having a hard time finding the bodies to build things to work different kinds of jobs. But that said, it's unavoidable that they're going to have to offer support of some kind, especially since so much of this industrial output is going to be suspended or intermittent. It's not just a matter of like fiscal policy offering subsidies or offering interest-free grants essentially to businesses to keep them afloat. It's going to be that they're going to have to find ways to effectively ration imports. Now, businesses are obviously increasingly turning to parallel imports and trying to get their goods through third countries, et cetera, to meet their needs. But it's hard to see how that's sustainable without some kind of coordinating mechanism at play. And we can see that the sanctions impact targeting the Russian military have had an impact on high-end systems. So we see reports of them stripping like cars for the GPSs and so on to put into military gear. And that's only going to get worse. And as that gets worse, then obviously the government's going to have to find a way to allocate the resources between the private sector, right, and the state sector, and the military in this case. And that kind of dynamic is also going to play out between different parts of the real economy. So I think that they're going to have to spend some money, but it's true that if they pursue a large fiscal expansion to kind of stave off a larger fall in output, it's actually going to be very inflationary, which in the short run is probably too scary for them to really meaningfully contemplate.
So what you're discussing inevitably means that the Russian state becomes even more involved in the Russian economy. If you're talking about rationing and the state actually deciding which modes of production actually get the inputs, I mean, that can only make the Russian economy even more brittle, couldn't it?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think the way we think of brittle, we tend to think of brittle in terms of any state involvement being bad, right? And the problem with the kind of involvement of the state in the Russian economy is not the fact that the state's involved; it's how it's involved. And so it's the fact that you have specific interest groups that are state-owned, capture policy, or you have, actually relatively weak regulatory institutions trying to issue rulings and then being overruled by someone in Moscow. So, not that I think that an expansion of the state's involvement is necessarily good for the Russian economy, in the long term, but in response to a major crisis of productive output and kind of a loss of very basic goods that are necessary, it's not necessarily bad. I mean, when I saw a story that that's not as true in the regions. In the regions, it's more like 50 to 70%. But in major cities in Russia, as much as 90% of the components used by like industrial size, kind of bakers essentially just to make bread are imported from Europe, and they're gone now. Like that's the state has to do something, right? That's not a viable state of affairs to simply allow price signals to kind of function as the rationing mechanism when people can go hungry. So I think that it's at one level, you can actually make an argument that if they properly administer the state intervention in this case, they actually would create more redundancy that would allow them to be more adaptable to these kind of shocks. Um, but I mean, I'm obviously not confident that's going to happen, and I think you're right that in the longer run, assuming that's the case, that it would make things worse. But I think that the real problem is that they have this mixed approach of having a state being really involved, still relying on market mechanisms, but then ultimately kind of deferring authority to really important coordinating decisions to these disparate bodies that are all vying for power on the basis of personal networks or kind of sectoral interests that don't really align.
So this is an interesting point you make about the sectoral interests, and you also mentioned earlier about state-owned entities engaging in regulatory capture, and this is something I've been thinking about. Now, I know you recently wrote a piece for The Diplomat talking about how Russia is basically trying to use Asia as a substitute for demand for their energy exports now that the sanctions are gradually cutting off their ability to export into Europe. And overall, that would suggest that the extractive industries in Russia are going to be declining. And at the same time, you have this increased demand for domestically produced goods in Russia. And if you put that together, it seems like it creates a very different structure of a Russian economy, essentially one where Gazprom, Rosneft, and other big extraction companies are simply less important. So, how do you think that structural transformation will affect the political economy of Russia, but also the power structure within the economy?
Right. So I don't know that I have a good schematic map in my head yet of what tomorrow looks like. I think that one of the most important things to kind of get your head around, if you're like a generalist kind of coming towards Russia and you don't really have the background knowledge of it, is Russia is not a gas station, despite John McCain's protestations and others in the United States. It's not a petrostate. It has a lot of characteristics of a petrostate, but it became dependent on oil exports in particular, but also gas exports after it had already industrialized and become a quite literate society, right? So it's a very different kind of structure where you have these exporting sectors led by natural resources, in this case energy, effectively propping up demand for domestic industrial sectors and kind of generating contracts and economic activity that then sustain the procurement orders for, let's say, gondola cars for coal, for coal or for other bulk commodity goods and so on. Because Russia's not making those and then selling them to people abroad who need them, especially since Russia has its own rail gauge, compared to its neighbors. Um, and that's the structure that I think is most kind of worrying and interesting to see. Is if you have this declining commodity resource export output, that inevitably means a decline in orders for these industries that effectively subsidize the relatively uncompetitive production for the domestic market by making their money selling to exporters or else exporting. You know, and I think as that transition plays out, you would expect to see the people who win state subsidies to make things becoming more and more important because obviously they can't be replaced. The problem is that I think we'd be biased towards thinking that there'll be like new companies or new players that kind of jump in that space. I actually don't think that's the case. I think what's likelier is that the exporters that already have entrenched power and interests are going to find ways to expand their relative power by moving into new markets, right? So like Rosneft's the kind of most egregious example of regulatory capture and a kind of fiefdom building, given that Rosneft was able to win state support to build the shipyard in the Far East, and then essentially won regulatory approval for what was a de facto ban or else limit on imports of like tankers and similar shipping capacity from South Korea by other Russian energy giants. So Rosneft was trying to position itself as the company making the tankers for the other Russian companies. And I think that's going to happen more and more. So you're going to have these kind of already dominant exporting players that already have a lot of political support and usually ties to the security communities at some point, or similar kind of blocks of interests in Moscow, um, kind of devouring the new industries that might otherwise arise. So that could prove to be wrong. I don't. I mean, I'm not at all wedded to that as like a narrative, but I think that the basic problem is it's hard to see that many new kind of players emerging, and I think that like the biggest winners would be companies like Rostec, firms that are supposed to be providing high end equipment to the domestic market, but that's usually the defense sector. And what's interesting is that going back to 2017, there was already this kind of nascent attempt or underlying shift to try to get Russian military companies that were slowly starting to lose export earnings because either the importers replaced their tech or stole their IP, or they came under sanction from the U.S. In particular when after CATSA started having an impact on purchases abroad of trying to sell domestic civilian goods to make up the loss of their export earnings for their military operation, the military side of the business. And I could see them being kind of being particular winners in the current environment because there's simply not that many other companies that can be mobilized that have like a heavy industrial capacity to move. The problem is that most of the light industry in Russia at some point relies on foreign partnerships for both its supply chain, but also kind of corporate practices and so on. I mean, Renault is obviously the biggest example that comes to mind for autos, but that's true for other things as well. So in the areas that are not deemed as strategic, I think we're likely to just to see chaos and then kind of have specific oligarchs who already have large businesses try to scoop up the competitors as they go under. But when it comes to the higher level stuff, when it comes to like semiconductors and things like that, it's going to be a fight between kind of existing defense manufacturers and the exporting companies like Rosneft. They're going to want to keep expanding their kind of relative power over the economy.
So one of the things that I think about is that Russia is increasingly going to have to create this greater domestic capacity to fill in the gap where they previously were importing. And it sounds to me a lot like the communist era, the Soviet era, when you essentially had these domestic industries being built up because you either couldn't or you didn't want to import those products from abroad. And you have essentially captive markets where, here's the industry and you're going to sell to this market and the domestic market can only buy from you. And that does not seem to me like a recipe for creating competitive companies. So how do you think this is going to play out? Is it going to be similar to the Soviet times where you essentially get whatever amount of products you do at whatever quality and consumers simply don't have a choice?
Yes. I mean, I think there are a few things about it. I think that the first thing that comes to mind is the whole first is tragedy, then is farce. Kind of approach. I mean, at one level, I agree it's not a recipe for success, but I think what's scary to contemplate is that the Soviet economy was better equipped institutionally to do that than the current Russian economy is. So going back to my prior point, the Soviet system was terrible in countless ways, but at least it had a coordinating mechanism up until basically, let's say, the mid 80s when it collapses or sort of begins to collapse for a variety of reasons that relate to its own flaws. To be able to coordinate, inputs and outputs between a kind of centralized plan, regional heads and enterprises, right? That doesn't exist anymore. So you essentially don't have the institutions or institutional framework to pursue that approach. What you have are these kind of de facto neoliberal, but also authoritarian kind of and personalist market institutions, that now primarily govern the Russian economy. So I think at one level, they are undoubtedly going to have to pursue autarky in a level they haven't, they haven't had to since they opened up for trade, and I think that's undeniable. I don't know quite how far they can go doing it, but it's going to happen. But what I think is more interesting and concerning is it's not really clear, how much they can actually substitute in the way they might have been able to in the past through brute force or through a semi-rational allocation of resources. Not obviously not rational from the perspective of like maximum gain or profit, but rather from a strategic goal. And it's not clear they even have that anymore because of how entrenched interest groups are. I see autarky as inescapable, but I also see it primarily as a function of just that they're just going to have to make Russian people a lot poorer and able to consume less to make it work. I mean, and I think one of the weird things that's also kind of lost in that comparison a little bit looking from today is that one of the main reasons why the Soviet system collapsed and it failed to rebalance was it failed to address the fact that the demand side of the economy in the Soviet system mattered, and they were never able to actually address the imbalance of kind of heavy industry versus light consumer industry, in part because they didn't really care about the demand side kind of view of how the economy functioned. Um, and what's weird is that in the contemporary context, ideologically and institutionally, Russia has the same problem. I mean, they actually still ultimately think about supply. They don't really think about demand as this kind of driver of growth, or something that they have to kind of worry about from a policy perspective. Um, and you can see that going back to 2014, after the first sanctions were placed on them after Crimea. I mean, most of the import substitution policies they adopted were basically subsidies to domestic production. They weren't about much else. And then and on top of that, they would then try to mandate that people have to buy domestic without thinking about whether or not there was demand in the first place for what was being mandated to be bought domestically. So it was a very strange combination, because they're essentially applying these approaches in the middle of a recession and then in stagnation, as opposed to like thinking about how growth would actually, like demand growth would actually drive investment domestically into production more organically. And so I think that from that perspective, if, and this is a big if Russia is able to kind of unlearn its kind of fiscal helplessness that it's adopted since the late 90s, and the degree to which I think they're just terrified of budget deficits, to a degree which, like, I literally understand in the current context, but in general it doesn't really make sense. That if they can kind of get over that, and if they can start finding a way to build a political settlement that allows them to coordinate inputs in a way that doesn't really risk the power of the regime that's kind of centralized in Moscow, then they can. I mean, I'm not going to say they can pull it off and it's going to be fine, but they can at least kind of muddle through that. But I don't see that happening in the current political environment.
So one thing you mentioned was about the need for Russian firms to get foreign know-how in joint investment projects, and you mentioned Renault as one example of that. And I thought it was very interesting that some of the messaging out of the West, when the sanctions were first announced, and talking about how Russian companies were no longer going to be able to get foreign capital, when it's not the capital that matters. The Russian economy has a surplus of capital. Right. In fact, it's the know-how. So how do you think this is going to affect not just the fact that foreign entities can't invest in Russia, but that foreign companies aren't bringing that know-how as part of those investments? And how can the Russian economy adapt to not being able to import that know-how?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it adapts by getting smaller and getting poorer. That's basically I mean, there's not really a whole lot they can do. I mean, it's a lot of the high price commodity environment is kind of obscuring how bad the problems are. I mean, the best example I can think of, I wish I actually was more in the kind of the weeds on, so I should probably read up on it after this this talk. But a lot of the refining capacity in Russia is dependent on imported component parts from Europe. But what matters more than the component parts is the fact that they had specialists who were trained to specific European standards and so on, who also came and helped them, arrange these refineries. To improve the relative quality of the products they were producing and to reduce emissions. And now that they can't get access to those things, it's inevitable that as their exports to Europe decline, that they're just going to have to throttle down capacity, because there's no market for those products in Asia. And when you lose refining capacity, like you have to mothball it eventually. And as we're seeing in the United States right now, for instance, when you go through a capacity reduction and you suddenly have any kind of underlying shift in demand needs, it tends to lead to a product squeeze. And that's an example where, like, we're not seeing it yet because they're still running, but when they start kind of running out of spare parts and so on later in the year, and they kind of the export window starts closing, that leads to kind of a permanent negative adjustment, right? When it comes to automaking, it's the same thing. I mean, they've already lifted safety requirements to the point where they're letting them make essentially cars without like airbags and other basic, parts, because they can't get enough parts. And obviously, on the one hand, the car still gets made and it gets bought by somebody, but then, fatalities rise. And so that creates knock-on costs across the economy that people don't, we can't really model them yet, but we know it's going to happen. And the same thing's already happening, like going back to my fuel example with fuel, because they're no longer worried about, refining Euro standard, I think 5 now, or whatever the number is, fuel. And so they're going to refine lower quality fuel because they just need to get the products out the door, which means more emissions and more pollutants in people's lungs across the regions where, they already don't really do a great job of taking care of the environment. So Um, those things are happening, and we're not seeing them immediately, but they're going to be much more visible by September, October. Um, I think in terms of know-how, you're going to start seeing it too. When it comes to the military equipment, because obviously, if they don't have people making the specific parts they need for like precision missiles, and they have to essentially throttle down production of them or massively slow it down, uh, you know, they're going to have to find ways of stealing that knowledge somehow, basically, or like kidnapping somebody. I don't really know. I don't know how they're going to get the knowledge. I mean, they can literally get it, but it's not going to be at scale and as accessible. And then not only do they have to get the knowledge, but they have to actually have the plant to use it, and they don't necessarily have that plant either. And we're seeing, like, I would argue, to some extent at least, that the change in approach on the battlefield in Ukraine reflects the fact that they have logistical constraints on the high end systems they can use. So they have to be careful about how much they use and ration the kind of higher end systems they have for specific uses. And so that's why they decide, okay, fine, we'll just rely on old school artillery that we can mass produce because the plant has not changed since World War II when it comes to the actual production techniques for the most part. Um, and so in that sense, like, I don't know how they replace it. I know that they can eventually. I can foresee, given that they've already lifted any kind of legal punishment for just openly using a foreign IP that you've stolen, that you're going to see more and more companies and individuals try to kind of freelance and do what the KGB did in the 80s and just try to steal, like, intellectual property, and deploy it. But they're not necessarily going to have the know-how themselves. They're going to have to kind of learn it on the fly. So, like, I do think that they can eventually adapt in some of these sectors, after a kind of a period of time of adjustment. But I don't know how long that period is, and it's definitely long enough that the relative economic losses will be immense. And I mean, even in the current scenario, guys like Greff are saying it'll take 10 years to kind of reach the pre-invasion level of GDP. But, like, I think that's optimistic. I think that realistically we would expect a continued decline next year to some extent, just based on these shortages. So yeah, it's almost like a return to, like, the kind of idealized KGB era of theft of Western tech. It's like the best they can hope for.
So historically, the way the Russian economy worked is you had a massive, or at least this year, massive, but in prior years, to varying degrees, a current account surplus. And then that extra capital essentially went abroad. And so many of the oligarchs and government officials preferred to keep their money overseas for a variety of reasons. But that basically limited domestic investment at home. And now that you have these capital controls, now the capital controls on domestic investors have been loosened somewhat, but still it's largely restricted. Do you think the fact that these oligarchs and other wealthy Russians are not able to move their money overseas will incentivize them in any way to increase investment domestically?
No, I mean, there are a couple of aspects to that. One is that I don't think that the capital controls are the reason money comes home. I think it's the fact that we sanction the oligarchs specifically that would cause them to pull their money out, right? So there's that aspect of it. Like, because I think even with a very stringent regime like has kind of been put in place, you can still find ways around it, and they can still pay somebody to, like, move $9,999 at a time, and so on, to get out of the country. So I mean, they can literally do that. And I think the likelier outcome is that it's less, there's more friction to it, but they move more money to Hong Kong and, like, Shanghai and Singapore. But that said, I think that the real issue in terms of investment domestically is just what do they invest in? Like, if so I think the only way that you can increase their investment is essentially ensuring profit. So that obviously means giveaways from the state, like huge concessions, effectively granting de facto monopolies or oligopolies that are negotiated in terms of price levels, and that ends up obviously being a huge drain, because you end up increasing inflation, decreasing efficiency of investment, and you end up producing less of what you actually need. So in that sense, I can see them buying more property in Russia, but I have a hard time, unless there's like a kind of new um, sweetheart deal that's adopted. I have a hard time seeing them meaningfully increasing their investment into the Russian economy.
Well, if the government isn't going to be investing in domestic capacity to a significant extent because it's inflationary, and the oligarchs don't want to do it, I mean, it's very hard to see how they're going to be able to build up any domestic capacity in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I think it goes back to the last March, actually, when Putin held a roundtable with the kind of his largest business heads and some of the richest Russians. And I mean, what he effectively was saying to business in Russia at the time was that mobilize, like mobilize your resources. Like he didn't, there was no meaningful, like offer. Like there wasn't like we'll give you this, or like the Russian economy is actually strong. Why aren't you investing? He wasn't saying what our inflation reflects, like excess profits as opposed to other factors. Like he was literally just saying like mobilize your resources. And the fact that that hasn't happened in the last year, I think, speaks to how weak the Russian state actually is when it comes to these things, despite the impression that what they're coming once happens, and to a large extent that is true. So I don't want to just dismiss it out of hand, but I don't know that they have anything other than sticks. And obviously, if they use sticks, then all oligarchs are going to just try to find ways to flee to wherever they can. Now, their money might obviously be stuck in Russia if they brought it back. I suspect, though, that unless they were, directly sanctioned, it wasn't. Um, so, yeah. So, I mean, I don't know how Russia can meaningfully mobilize capital without, again, just like having a more expansive kind of like state capacity to actually just coordinate investment and direct investment directly. To actually just be the deciding who gets money. And they don't really take that approach because they usually use subsidies and tax breaks instead, which a tax break is great, but if there's not demand for the product in the first place, it doesn't matter if it's there. So like it's kind of a catch-22, right? Like the only way they're going to be able to draw money in is if they increase demand domestically. But right now you're seeing a surge of demand for domestically produced goods, but in industries that are experiencing contractions of aggregate demand. And that's the kind of dynamic that I don't know. I don't know how they can square it using private capital. I think it would require public money, and probably also like a rewiring of the fiscal system to some extent in terms of like how they delegate authority and allowing regions to actually direct more investment, or like local governments to direct more investment and so on. But I don't see that happening because obviously, like in a higher inflation environment, and especially in the midst of a war that they can't mobilize for. I mean, they still haven't conscripted as many people as they can because they're worried about mobilization. Um, it's ultimately the working class who have been the kind of core constituency of regime support for the last decade who are suffering the most and who also are the most like ambivalent or else against the war, even if they don't express it openly, because they don't like. A lot of people will say I'm for it, but no one wants to serve, and that usually is kind of a giveaway. There's a disconnect between the kind of the perception of like we like having like great power status, but also we don't actually want to be involved with this. And I think that the latter is a more telling indicator about how people feel about it than the former. So
We'll have to leave it there, but Nick, thanks so much for a really fascinating discussion.
of course, no, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here.